Chinese Nobel Peace Laureate Liu Xiaobo has been released from prison on medical parole. This, as the human rights activist is treated in hospital for late-stage liver cancer. The 61-year-old veteran of the Tiananmen Square student protest received an 11-year sentence in 2009 for inciting subversion of state power. This after he helped draft a petition known as Charter 08, calling for sweeping political reforms in China. His awarding of the Nobel a year later led to Beijing freezing relations with Norway, relations that were only normalized last December. His wife, Liu Xia, has been under effective house arrest ever since his Nobel Prize. Liu's lawyers say the parole doesn't mean he's completely free.
In principle, he will not be allowed to see guests or visitors because of the special nature of his case. For most common cases, people have some freedom to go home, meet friends, etc. Under medical parole, a person is still serving a term while being treated in a medical facility, even if it's outside of prison. Liu Xiaobo's case is special. I don't think the authorities will allow him to have visitors.
For more, let's cross to Sophie Richardson, Advocacy Director of the Asia Division of Human Rights Watch. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me.
Your reaction to this medical parole?
Well, it's obviously better to let him out to get treatment, but it is appalling that he has been allowed to become so sick. This is somebody who was reasonably healthy when he went into prison, and I think our and others' work documenting the denial of adequate treatment to people in detention in China suggests that we should not have arrived at this point.
Shouldn't have arrived at this point, and you heard the attorney saying it's not really a release.
Yeah, I think he's absolutely correct that while Liu may be in a different facility, he is by no means free. And let's be very clear, this is somebody who has done nothing to violate Chinese law. He never should have been in prison in the first place. And in addition to the torture that he has suffered in detention, his wife, who has not been involved in any sort of activities, never convicted of anything, has also been held under house arrest since 2010. And so I think Chinese authorities have a great deal to answer for in their treatment of these people.
Liu Xiaobo, who was active in the Tiananmen Square student protests, he's convicted in 2009 under the presidency of Hu Jintao, but he remains in prison under the current leader, Xi Jinping. What does that tell you?
Well, one of the hallmarks of Xi Jinping's tenure has been a ferocious crackdown on independent civil society, not just people like Liu Xiaobo, a sort of established critic of the government, but human rights lawyers, public health activists, even people who wanted to run rural libraries have now been the targets of the authorities' ire. And I think the treatment of Liu, to allow him to become this sick before giving him access to better care, presumably better care, I think shows just how brass-knuckled a regime this is and how reasonably uninterested it is in either international criticism or simply listening to the peaceful criticisms of its own population.
Is he someone who's known inside of China?
He does have a certain following, and certainly, one of the government's bits of hysteria about his winning the Nobel Peace Prize was that it was going to elevate his profile even more. So he's not widely known. He's probably not as well known inside China as he may be outside. But certainly, I think if they let him die as a result of inadequate treatment and care, he's going to be better known. It's probably worth pointing out that the People's Daily and Xinhua, some of the state media agencies, have been tweeting this morning about how Liu Xiaobo, emphasizing a convicted criminal, this is their terminology, not ours, has been granted medical parole as if this was some marvelously beneficent gesture on the government's part. So I think they're certainly feeling some of the pressure about his treatment this morning.
Sophie Richardson, what's your sense? Are ordinary citizens in China indifferent to this case?
Oh, I don't think so. I think there are quite a few people across China who experience all manner of injustice and are frustrated by their inability, to get officials to uphold the law or enforce court verdicts or simply do the right thing. And I think it is not a good sign for the near-term future for the government and the party to simply keep suppressing these demands rather than respond to them in a systematic way with, for example, an independent, credible legal system.
Because the argument that's put forth often is that there's this bargain between the Chinese leadership and the population. We won't trouble you when it comes to civic freedoms, and in exchange, the state provides for us.
I think that bargain is fraying. I mean, if you, for example, look at the recent protests over environmental pollution in Shanghai, or you look at the levels of concern about impunity for local officials in sort of routine bureaucratic matters, I think there is a fair amount of frustration. I think the party and the government leadership are aware of that, but what they're not willing to do is shift power into nonpartisan systems like the media or the courts that would adjudicate disputes based on what the law actually says, because they fear they would lose power. But I think it would be a mistake to suggest that Chinese people are not irate about the current state of affairs.
You mentioned Liu's wife, Liu Xiao. She's been under effective house arrest ever since his Nobel Prize back in 2009. She's never been formally charged, if I understand it correctly. Do we know anything more about the conditions under which she's prevented from leaving the house?
Well, she's been confined to a compound, her family's compound, an apartment in Beijing, and allowed very few visitors. She's sporadically been allowed a little bit of contact with some friends and occasionally been allowed out. She has not been regularly allowed access to Liu Xiaobo. It's been somewhat unpredictable, and there's a lot of pressure on her to keep even the fact of those visits under wraps. But a very evocative video clip of her was posted on Twitter about an hour ago, saying that she's been informed by doctors that Liu Xiaobo is too ill for chemotherapy or surgery. And I think that clip shows just how devastating this experience has been, not just for him, but for her.
Is the news of his medical parole going to mean that she is allowed to go free?
We just don't know at this point. I assume that the authorities will want her to stay quiet or to keep her quiet. It's not clear what she wants, and it's not clear what's going to happen to his health. But I think we can be reasonably confident that the authorities will do all they can to keep both of them quiet.
Sophie Richardson, one final question for you. The new Trump administration, how are they handling China when it comes to human rights?
It's a pretty mixed picture at this point. We've seen some senior officials, for example, at the National Security Council, meet with the wives of some of the detained, some of China's most prominent detained human rights lawyers, and that's a very welcome development. But we're really not seeing the kind of systematic push that we have in the past through regular interactions by the State Department, for example, or other cabinet members for individuals' release. I think there's a very strong focus on looking at Americans who are detained in China, people like Sandy Fan-Gillis, who was released about 6 weeks ago. But it's not clear whether or how that's going to translate into pushing for the release of people who don't necessarily have an explicit connection to the U.S.
Sophie Richardson of Human Rights Watch, many thanks for speaking to us from Washington.
Thank you.